Hello, listeners, and welcome to a special Halloween edition of Hidden Oaks. Before we get into the episode, I'm excited to tell you about a contest that we're starting today. Our friend James over at breachersinc.com made several beautiful wooden mugs and travel mugs on his lathe and burned them with the Hidden Oaks logo. We have 3 of them up for grabs for you all. We'll put pictures and links up at hiddenoakspodcast.com for you to check out. So here's how you can win one. In 3 weeks, we're going to have a drawing. You can get your name entered into the drawing up to 2 times. Once for leaving a review of our show through the podcast app that you listen to us through, and then sending us a screenshot of your post to hiddenoakspodcast@gmail.com. And then another entry for commenting on our website on your favorite episode on the episodes page. Again, we'll wait for the comments and reviews to come in, and in 3 weeks, we'll draw for the winners of the 3 beautiful wooden mugs. I wish you all the best of luck. Now back to the show. For this bonus episode, we'll be traveling back in time to visit 3 characters from Season 1. These stories take place 1 year before the events of the Hidden Oaks that you all know. A young programmer receives a strange message from an unknown neighbor. A bully laments change before a nightmare finds her, and the dead revel in their one night of freedom. Welcome to Hidden Oaks. Boys are so easy. Well, not all boys, but these are. And maybe not easy, but easy to impress. For crying out loud, why can't I just say something punchy without overthinking it? When I moved here, I had no expectations whatsoever. The computer lab is small, but we can basically do whatever we want. And yes, everyone who hangs out in here is a boy except me. At first, anytime I'd do a render or run one of my own programs, and they'd all be floored or say it was awesome, part of me always assumed they'd meant awesome for a girl. But after a few weeks, it was pretty clear that wasn't it. A quick registry hack looks like black magic to these boys. They've never even seen a debugger. They call themselves computer nerds, but don't actually know a thing. Oh, but I can't say that. Oh no, it's not friendly, it's not polite, it's not ladylike. Jiminy crickets, I hate that word. That and all the other words we're supposed to chase after, all the other synonyms for dull. Speaking of dull, might I take a little detour? There's not a lot of overlap between we computer geeks and the jocks. Okay, there's basically 0 overlap, so naturally each group is going to talk about how much better they are than the other, behind closed doors. These boys don't watch sports and mock those that do. Fine by me. I'm pro-mockery in all forms. And the Neanderthal us versus them pissing contests, yeah, pretty dumb. But then these same guys will argue about Macs versus PCs or Windows versus Linux or even Slackware versus Red Hat. Maybe it's just a guy thing to have to love one team and hate another. The ladylike thing would probably be to let them make their arguments and feel like big, smart, good boys. Screw that. I say love the game, not the teams. Computers are only getting smaller and faster and cheaper. Most people are lazy and stupid and like it that way. It doesn't take an AP student to figure out that machines are going to be making society's decisions at some point. I don't know about these guys, but I plan to be on top of that, not swallowed up underneath. Okay, my last entry was a little rough on the computer lab gang. They're actually learning a lot. At least, when they aren't printing out an entire script for Monty Python and the Holy Grail, or downloading grainy QuickTime videos of anything and everything they can find about the space shuttle. I won't pretend I don't love that stuff too. Though maybe not Star Wars. Seriously, what is it with these guys in Star Wars? All I really meant before was, those computers are incredible sophisticated tools that can do anything we program them to. And most of the time, these boys just use them to access stuff other people did. They do get into it sometimes, though. John is curious enough to try weird stuff. The keyboards in the Mac lab are still the kind with ADB, where you plug the mouse into the keyboard and only need one cable running back to the computer. John was screwing around over lunch the other day and realized that he could daisy chain multiple keyboards together. Since then, it's been a daily ritual to have the whole gang typing into one computer at once, and then have one of us read off and interpret the resulting gibberish into a story or limerick or fortune cookie as best we can. We've had more than a few keepers already. Say what I might about these awkward half-boy, half-man weirdos, they're my weirdos, and they're pretty fun. Lee came into the lab today on regular student, non-computer nerd business. I think he might be even more shy than the guys who are always in here. It's really easy to tell when he's thinking hard because he can't think and walk upright at the same time. He gets this little waddle until he either bonks into someone, to his credit he did say sorry and help me pick up my books, or realizes he's doing it, then straightens up and goes all presentation mode. I get it. We all have to pretend to be normal and ordinary and dull in school, because we'll be eaten alive otherwise. It's too bad. I like his waddle. It's kind of cute. Makes me wonder what he's thinking about so hard. With most guys, it's really not hard to guess. Wow, it's been a while since I've written anything. My latest touch for our keyboard chain jumbled up message of the day was to bring in one of Dad's old printers with a serial adapter we designed and soldered ourselves. Now we don't even need a computer or its display. What the room collectively types goes right to the page, complete with the sounds of good old-fashioned dot matrix printing. For bonus points, the character encodings don't completely match up, and the voltages are, as Dad says, probably, definitely, wildly out of spec. So sometimes the printer thinks it sees flow control bytes and ends up printing over the same line again, or feeding a whole page through, or whatever. We would probably be more worried about what happens when we run out of perforated paper, if the library back room didn't have stacks of boxes of the stuff. Which reminds me, maybe it was just the size of my old school, but I think it's trippy how I can literally walk in here with a printer and tuck it into a corner of the computer lab, or how the librarian doesn't bat an eye at any of us going into the back room. If I or any of my fellow nerds are seen in the hall during class time, everybody just assumes we're going to help a teacher with the network or fix a projector or something. Ian and I walked out and drove off one day carrying the school's $10,000 video camera, and nobody batted an eye. Granted, we generally are going around fixing stuff. The assumption that we're too smart and nerdy to be making trouble is, sadly, basically true. Anyway, tomorrow's Halloween, so we've each brought in a book to type scary stories from. I brought in Dad's hardcover of Edgar Allan Poe, which I'll open to a random page and start copying. I saw Nathan has that Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark book where the drawings are way creepier than the stories themselves. It's kind of fun when we do the transcription style instead of just mashing random keys. Ironically, the gibberish is usually farther away from actual words and needs more interpretation, but the layout is usually much more interesting. We basically get a story, plus an ink blot test. Our Halloween edition keyboard chain took a weird turn I haven't quite figured out yet. Everything seemed to be going normally. A minute or two of everybody feeding chaos into the system, then the telltale repetitive buzz indicating the printer wasn't going to do any more printing. Just a few lines had printed, in the shape of a smile or a banana. That was clue number 1 that someone was pranking us. At least it wasn't a boner, so some credit for restraint, I guess. The printer was stuck moving the head back and forth one character and tore through the ribbon. We couldn't get it to work again. Our probably, definitely, wildly out of spec treatment of the equipment seems to have finally caught up with us. Whether that was part of the prank, who can say? But what really doesn't add up is what actually got printed. It's all numbers for most of the shape, but right in the middle are 3 words, all in lowercase. Brave Bridge Below. At least that's what we thought at first, but the letter B was actually the number 6. So out of all the words we were all typing, The printer managed to only hear spaces and numbers until it got halfway through, stuck a good old satanic 666 onto 3 B words, went back to printing more spaces and numbers, and then crapped out. It's actually not a bad prank, in that I don't understand how it was done. Aside from the question of who's even smart enough to have set it up, there was no program to intercept or rewrite. There's just serial signals going from keyboard circuits to a printer circuit. I thought it must have been Dad hiding some kind of sneaky trick in the serial converter we built, but I tested and wired each part myself, both when we built it and again tonight. Plus, Dad is the easiest person to read on the face of the earth. He would have been asking if anything interesting happened at school and holding his breath, fighting back a big smile, and making actual human eye contact. His mischief mode is pathetically transparent. He passed it on to me, so I should know. Well, whatever. I don't know who did or could have set up that weird message, but good job, you got me. And you broke Dad's old printer. It's late and tomorrow's Halloween, so I refuse to lose sleep over it. Good night. I seriously wrote that? Of course I did. It's now the middle of the night and I just had the most messed up nightmare. I've never woke up this sweaty and scared. The worst part is I opened this dumb journal specifically to write down what I dreamed and I already can't remember. It's completely gone, except for the bridge below. I don't even remember seeing anything, just the words pounding in my brain. Literally losing sleep over it right after vowing not to. Classic me. Good night. Actually, I wonder sometimes if what happened at the Holmdel horn antenna also happens within complex organic circuits. Say a human being or even simple little stupid electric circuits, like our keyboard chain. If a radio telescope looking for signals bouncing off echo satellites could end up mapping the universe's radiation from the Big Bang, who's to say a delicate electromagnetic instrument like a human brain or even a dumb, wildly out-of-spec circuit built for screwing around couldn't pick up on some kind of other signal? Something it wasn't meant to do but ends up detecting anyway. Alright, I'm sleepy again. This should make for a good laugh when I read it with an awake brain. Good night. A rare weekend entry. Ugh, but I'm not going to do that tired thing where I write about my writing habits. Except for just there when I wrote about writing about writing about writing. Shut up. Well, I was not wrong, that's pretty amusing. Some serious wackadoodle stuff there, sleepy me. Some kind of mysterious energy, not yet understood, as interpreted by a bunch of obsolete computer peripherals cobbled together, working in not even remotely harmony. At least it's a step or two removed, I hope, from people who ask Ouija boards questions or think lens flares are spirit orbs. Interesting. Maybe even plausible, but not exactly helpful. What the actual living hell? I just pulled that printout out of my backpack and it was dripping with blood. It looked like everywhere that ink had touched was stabbed into a gushing vein. I can still smell it. I can taste it. I dropped the page the instant I saw it, and by the time it hit the floor, all the blood was gone. Just like my dream last night. Poof. Nothing left. This happening on Halloween is just perfect. I don't know if somebody slipped me something or what. Whatever, I'm out. No more blood, no more bridge, no more keyboard chain readings. I'm just going back to stunning the local nerd boys with my ability to add 2-digit numbers in my head and write programs that write other programs. And if some cosmic radiation wants to tell me about a brave bridge below, next time it can send me a nice cute message instead. Screw you, Halloween. Aubrey smiled at herself in the mirror of Clement's bathroom. This was it. This was the night. She sighed and poked through a makeup bag. It had been her mother's. It was violet and dark, like Aubrey's hair, which was tied in a ponytail dangling on her small shoulders. It still smelled like her mom, a distant mixture of perfume with hints of baby powder. She needed its memory tonight. This was her mom's favorite holiday. Tonight, once Aubrey, Clement, and Ty were done tormenting kids and stealing their candy, they were going to a high school party someone was hosting close to Hidden Oaks Park. Ty knew them. He knew everybody. There was going to be beer, pot, and spin the bottle. All three debaucheries paled in comparison to the overall majesty Aubrey felt about Old Hallows Eve, the one night of the year for mischief. The holiday primed for sneaking, stalking, fighting, stealing, smashing, and wrecking was here. It was the only night of the year she was fully expected to be a monster. Getting ready at Clement's house was a strategic choice for Aubrey. Normally she would blame this avoidance on her father, but he was not there tonight. He would be at Joe DiMaggio's extra late because of their costume contest. It was because Aubrey did not have candy, decorations, or anything else festive. It was embarrassing. Her dad barely kept the utilities going and the mortgage paid. There was always plenty of beer in the fridge, though, but not a few extra bucks for a plastic witch or paper pumpkin to sit along the windows. Before the sun went down, Aubrey invited herself over to Clement's for dinner. He was a bit resistant since he had two younger brothers and his mom ran daycare. His house was literally full to the top with toys. Cars, Legos, Duplos, dolls, dinosaurs, Transformers, and Hot Wheels were spilling out of every cabinet, box, bucket, and couch cushion in colorful plastic piles. Even in the bathroom, along the white sink illuminated by 3 bulbs above a round mirror, there were remnants of this hoard. A plastic croissant, a Barbie head, and a hammerhead shark sat behind the faucet, watching Aubrey like judges in a reality show. She applied some eyeliner, lipstick, and mascara. Aubrey then rinsed her mouth out with some water and donned her mask. It was a plastic caricature of a demented old man with saggy white flesh, wounded black eyes, and wisps of gray hair that looked like cobwebs. She had drizzled some extra fake blood on it, an enhancement that Ty said did not need to be added, but Aubrey wanted it to resemble what she feared the most. Her father, with her blood on him. Ty and Clement were waiting for her by the entryway, which was piled with mounds of children's coats, boots, scarves, gloves, mittens, and shoes. Aubrey was wearing a green flannel tucked into a denim skirt she found in her mom's stuff in the basement. She had added some more ruby droplets to it as well, which again, both Ty and Clement thought was overkill. Aubrey walked out and put on her tennis shoes. The air smelled like stale clothing, plastic, and sweat. There were giggles of laughter from various kids throughout the house. "You two look pretty fucking gay," Aubrey said, staring at Ty and Clement with a shaking head. Clement, the taller one, was dressed in a Super Mario outfit, complete with blue overalls, red shirt and cap, plus a fake mustache glued beneath his nose. Ty, the shorter one, was dressed in what appeared to be a green lizard costume with plastic scales, long claws, a protruding snout, and 2 bulbous red eyes. He was wearing a Star Trek uniform as well, one of the red ones from the original series. "Shouldn't you be fucking Luigi?" Aubrey said, looking at Ty. She pushed some toys on the floor so she could sit down to lace her shoes up. They clattered and tumbled. They would have run away from her if they could. "Or wait, Clement is taller, he should be Luigi, and you should be Mario because you're shorter. Now I get it, or would have gotten it since you're a fucking lizard." "A Gorn," Ty replied beneath a large mask. "A what?" Aubrey said, standing up. "A Gorn from Star Trek, the original series. Kirk fights one," Ty said. His voice was high but muffled. Aubrey knew what a Gorn was but did not want to admit it. "You guys are such fucking nerds, let's go," she said, stepping outside. It was a perfect October evening. The twilight was sullen, thick but not dark. Aubrey noticed that on Halloween, the blackness of the sky did not have the same abyssal posture as other evenings. Instead, it had an aura of mischief, like a supernatural twinkle was scattered amongst the leafless eaves and apricot streetlights. The cold air had strings of anticipation attached to it, like all the mundane forces of everyday life were suspended and about to be pulled aside like curtains for the unreal to enter. On just this one night, the legions of normality were given a reprieve. The abnormal was given a free pass to wander and revile. "Hurry the fuck up, you faggots," Aubrey said, walking ahead of them down the road. They were just a year away from starting high school. Pretty soon, egging people's houses, stealing kids' candy, and toilet papering trees would be stories they kicked around over a late-night reunion at Perkins. Aubrey did not want to waste a single second not embracing their traditional trouble. Her favorite ritual was hiding along the street in bushes and behind trees, then jumping at kids out trick-or-treating. They would always target children without their parents, scaring them violently enough to make them drop their candy, which they would pick up and pour into the pillowcases they were carrying. Then they would tear up or break whatever receptacle their victims had been using, just in case they returned to salvage their bounty. Crushed plastic pumpkin baskets with twisted black handles became abusive echoes along the leaf-crusted curb. Ty and Clement were not as interested in tormenting the neighborhood this year. They humored Aubrey by bullying a few people enough to munch on their loot. They were more entranced by the party they would be attending later that night. They hung behind Aubrey as she stalked along, chewing on Butterfingers and casually throwing the wrappers on the ground. They were making their way to Hidden Oaks to sit on the playground and smoke a few cigarettes Ty's older brother Bean had given them. The air was cool, breezy, and a bit sour from the decaying leaves and frosted over grass. Houses sat in a lit line of hazy porch lights, jack-o'-lanterns, and a variety of dangling skeletons. A few mountainous clouds dragged across the sky like snails. Car horns honked at clever costumes. Children giggled sprinting up to front doors. Animatronic decorations in the form of bats, ghouls, and vampires sang out artificial cackles randomly. Halloween was picturesque in New Brighton, like the cover of a horror film you would get from the video store. It took Aubrey, Ty, and Clement a bit longer to reach the park than usual. Ty threw a rock at a parked car's window. Clement peed on his math teacher's garage. Aubrey scared 3 more kids, wrenching away their plastic bags, tearing them in the process. The road felt longer to them as they rounded the corner toward Hidden Oaks, like that asphalt streak stretched out before them was a rubber band being pulled back. There were no other kids or cars beneath the amber crowns of streetlights. The air around the park was quiet, vacuous, with only a little room for the occasional stir of wind turning the leaves over along the street in scratches. They walked past the church and up a few hills to the playground nestled behind Hidden Oaks. It was dark around the structure, with only a couple of beams from the church's lit parking lot piercing the gloom. Visibility was not an issue. They had memorized the formation years ago. They climbed to the top of a yellow slide with rust along its lips and sat down inside of its square entrance. They lit their cigarettes and leaned alongside the wooden planks that composed the structure, which were cold and splinter-wild. All 3 knew not to rub their skin against these surfaces. Too many times when they were kids they had made this mistake, which led to them running home crying for a parent to save them with tweezers and hydrogen peroxide. "Who do you think will be at the party later?" Clement said, pushing a plume of smoke starward. A wistful shadow of change was lurking around this holiday. All 3 kids were cogitating deeply, even if they did not want to. "Who fucking cares?" Aubrey said. "Tommy, Sharif, Melissa, Bryce, Nate, Al, a bunch of the popular kids," Ty said. His voice was sharp and nasally. He coughed once while inhaling but tried to hide it with a sneeze. "Maybe we'll get invited to it next year, and the year after. It'll become like a thing for us," Clement said. "Ugh, I hope not," Aubrey said. "Times are a-changin', aren't they? One more year till high school, then who knows," Ty said. "God, there are no kids coming through here tonight. So strange. We need to move to a new spot soon. I don't have enough candy yet," Aubrey said. Ty and Clement didn't say anything. Their disinterest did not require words. An autumn gust rattled the equipment. A few clouds split like bread above them, letting out a pearl arrow of moonlight, which cut the night like an untouched tomb were being opened. Where the ray landed was just down the block, behind the hill and sign for Hidden Oaks. It was shining on a house just across the street from a bit of woods. All 3 kids curiously stood up like meerkats. "Has that house always been there? I thought it was a field or something," Clement said. "Yeah, I never noticed it," Ty said. Aubrey's eyes widened a little bit but then squinted back into a cynical gaze. She had taken off her mask before they had gotten to the park. It was sweaty and smelled like Band-Aids. "You still got those eggs, Clement?" Aubrey said. "Yeah, saving them for Will's house. What you thinking?" "I'm thinking we got a new target. Let's go check it out," she said. They crept along the thin grass, weaving between trees and bits of light. The closer they got to the home, the more details started to appear to them. It was a 2-story colonial house with white siding, a black roof, and 4 pillars surrounding the open front door. It reminded Aubrey of something she would see on a tour through a historical site for school, like Fort Snelling or something. A balcony with ebony rails wrapped around the building like a mask. Along them were tendrils of garland, only instead of the standard Halloween colors of orange and black, they glowed with a phosphorescent blue. There were hints of green to it, enough to make it seem like the 2 hues were battling one another like stardust does in a trail behind a meteor. They were hypnotic to Aubrey, like she knew them from something before, or what had not yet come to be. "What's going on here?" Clement said, walking up to the house. Inside there were people moving about in what looked like dances. Their shadows swung behind windows which were burning with small tears of candlelight. Aubrey could smell the sweet bite of their wax from the lawn. The swaying silhouettes were on every level of the home, flashing against each opening, except for that front door, which yawned open like a gate to the underworld. "Okay, we got to check this out," Ty said, ripping off his Gorn mask and arms. He set them on the lawn and wandered up to the stairs leading to the house. Wait, Ty, hold on. You're just going into someone's house without even asking?" Aubrey said. She was typically the maverick of the group, but it was always fostered by a bit of calculation. She was also the indisputable leader of the crew. No way would Ty or Clement act on their own accord so outright. The place had an eerie magnetism to it. Something about the glow in its lines was pulling them inside. In just moments, Aubrey's mask was off, and she was following them like ants to a dot of sugar. As they walked up the stairs, a little girl passed them, leaving. She was pale, short, with red hair and an old-fashioned dress that reminded Aubrey of Little House on the Prairie. She stopped and looked at Aubrey for a moment. It was hard to discern her features in the dimness, but she looked to be smiling. Then she turned and walked quickly into the woods across the road. Aubrey felt something familiar about her. She could not figure out what exactly. "You coming in, Aubrey? You've got to take a look at this place," Clement said. She pulled her pillowcase close to her chest like a shield and ascended the rest of the steps. Inside the home there was no furniture, pictures, or anything else that would make it feel hospitable. It was a split entry, with wooden floors and dark trim along its ceilings. There was an intense murkiness to the rooms, like they were exploring the bottom of a well or pit. From wall to wall, the party was packed with people, but they looked strange. They were all deathly pale to the point that their flesh seemed to be translucent. Normal streaks and points of blue veins did not peep upwards from their skin, but instead there were sooty lines of phantasmal energy. The women were dressed in silky Victorian-looking dresses, the type seen on Masterpiece Theater, which Aubrey's mom used to watch with her. The men had tuxedos and suits of black. On both their heads were masks that covered just their eyes and foreheads. These veils were jeweled with bits of gloom, like the night sky had been broken down into nuggets of onyx and forced into these pieces. Aubrey, Ty, and Clement were speechless. The entire crowd was dancing in some sort of slow waltz with little variation to their movements. Despite the rising waves of this ghoulish merry-go-round, the atmosphere was languorous and watchful. In the main room just beyond where the kids were standing was the only furnishing they could identify. It was a small table, bone white with long legs that were attached to 4 skulls that propped up an oval of glass. Atop it was a single record player, with no buttons or dials. A record spun beneath a red point, which complemented the cone attached above it, which was a thick crimson, like a still-beating heart. Despite the rotating machine, no music was hitting the air. It was completely silent. "What is happening?" Aubrey whispered to herself. The movements suddenly stopped, the figures petrified in place. Time refused to move forward. Air molecules sat suspended. A single mouth began screaming, followed by another and another, until the whole menagerie was howling. It strangled itself into a deafening chorus, making the surrounding reality bow and buckle like a sound wave. "Run!" Aubrey said. charging for the door, followed by Ty and Clement. They flew down the steps, across the lawn, and through the park. They ran back to the playground to get their bearings. The shrieks seemed to contort behind them, lurking behind them like they were still inside those haunted walls. They climbed up the slide and started over the top of it slowly, not wanting the house to notice them looking for it. The house was gone. An empty spot of grass gazed back at them. They looked at each other in disbelief, then back at the space. "What the hell happened? That was nuts," Clement said, climbing down to the ground. Aubrey followed with a big smile, even though she was terrified and questioning. It was moments like this on Halloween that she loved. She did not want experiences like this to end. How shitty it would be to be just a Halloween decoration at a party, Aubrey thought. "Oh, fuck, my Gorn costume. My mom spent like a month on that. I gotta go get it back," Ty said, jogging toward where he'd left it on the ground. He did not want to get too close to where the masquerade had happened. He settled for a hill about 30 feet away where he could see well enough in the night. "Shit, it's gone. Where the hell did it go?" Ty said, spinning in a partial circle. Just a few blocks away, Will and Darius were finishing up trick-or-treating. They were walking back to Darius's house with a couple of Target bags full of candy when someone started to approach them. The night was pretty late. The majority of kids had retreated home to sort through their bounty. The figure moved towards them from a dark spot between two ramblers, pushed back along the lawns. "You see that?" Will said, pointing at the approaching shape. He was dressed in his dad's bathrobe and carrying a lightsaber. "Yeah, I think so," Darius said. He was dressed as Tuxedo Mask from Sailor Moon. He was carrying a live rose in his left hand, which he had clipped the thorns off of after cutting himself repeatedly. The closer the person got to them in the October inkiness, the more the two of them realized that it was not a human being at all, but a floating head with a pair of arms. It was scaly, clawed, and had two large eyes that caught the orange glint of the streetlights. Will let out a shriek and fell onto the ground as it passed them. The apparition was uninterested in them or their reaction, and casually glided by. Darius helped his friend up as they watched it vanish down 14th Street. Darius straightened his top hat. "Was that a Gorn?" he said as the night turned into a memory. The night was clear and the air was crisp as the dead man walked out of the mausoleum. The waxing gibbous moon cast its light over the steps on which he stood. He gazed out across the cemetery, and as he did, he tipped the wide brim of his pale gray fedora with a finger that was all bone. A skeletal woman in a tattered white dress was walking across his path with an equally tattered dark parasol held above her head. When she saw him, she stopped, faced him, and gave a slight curtsy before going on her way. He smiled the permanent smile of death that everyone wore after the years rotted away the flesh from their bones. Internally, whatever that meant for someone in his state, he smiled as well. He was excited. It was All Saints' Eve. This was the one night every year where he and others like him could roam about the world of the living, if they so chose, to reminisce about their former lives and to check in on their still living loved ones. He stood leaning on his cane and reached a hand up to the breast pocket of his suit to check one more time before venturing out into the night. Ah, yes. He had remembered to grab the last of his favorite cigars out of the case he had been interred with. When he had been laid to rest, there had been 50 of them, and now he was down to his last. He didn't enjoy one every Halloween, but more often than not, he did. One of these years, he would have to get some more. Now that he knew he had everything he needed, he haunted his way out of the graveyard. First, as always, he checked in on his legacy. The church, for which he had donated the land and over half the capital and materials to construct. He enjoyed the familiar creaks and groans of the floorboards beneath his feet. He ran his hands over the fine oak back of the furthest row of pews from the front of the sanctuary. It clacked beneath his settling fingers and thrummed as he ran his hand along the surface worn smooth with age and use. He rested there for a few minutes, taking in the majesty of this room that was now nearing a century old. As he stood there, he thought about how he wanted to spend the remaining fleeting hours of this special night. He didn't have anyone left to check in on. The only thing that really mattered to him in the living world were the church and the cemetery itself. His family line had come to an end with his own passing, so unlike the others, he had no one to check in on. He tended to find new and exciting things to do, however. There were always a number of ghostly gatherings, seances to drop in on, various rituals occurring in fields and woods nearby, revenant masquerades in phantom houses, children to scare. Sometimes he liked to simply blend in with the crowds of trick-or-treaters or costumed partygoers. He enjoyed people a great deal, even in life. He had been somewhat of a social butterfly. He'd never hesitated to make a new connection or a new friend. Wherever he'd gone, people had loved him. He'd made friends quickly, and his friendships had lasted a lifetime. He had been trustworthy, dependable, and always there for many people. On top of that, he had always had charisma, charm, and a knack for being somewhat of a performer when he was in a crowded room. Many times he had been called the life of the party. But he had been to plenty of these ghostly parties and rituals, and they didn't fulfill him anymore. They lacked the substance he remembered gatherings having had when he was alive. The dead just hung around, as though they had all forgotten what it was like to be alive. These gatherings had grown dull, even if it was only one day every year for the past 64. He wished he didn't have to stick to the shadows and for one night could simply mingle with real, living strangers and make new friends like he had in the old days. Without having made up his mind, he exited the church and began to walk down the street. 3 costumed kids that might have been teenagers passed him on the other side of the street as he walked. The girl, as he judged by her skirt, was wearing the bloodied mask of a beaten old gray-haired man. The other 2 were a lizard man, and what he guessed was an Italian trade worker. The foul and obscene language they used so casually with one another made him shudder. Nonetheless, he tipped his hat to them as they looked over at him. The lizard person gave him the finger, and they all walked on. Some things in the modern world, he was glad he didn't have to live with. He continued on his moonlit ramble, observing the ever-changed houses, roads, and cars, and the hardly changed children running through the night from house to house to fill their bags, buckets, and pillowcases with as much candy as they could carry. As the night wound on, he drifted along circuitous neighborhood routes. The children grew fewer, and the young adults grew more. These latter were not seeking candy door to door, but driving or walking to various establishments or parties nearby. He stopped at the corner of one of the side streets and Silver Lake Road. He paused just outside of the direct spotlight of the street lamp above him. Due to his wide-brimmed hat, his face was hidden more in shadow here than it had been before, and he knew that. Silver Lake Road was an excellent place to people watch, and at this point, that's what he had decided to do. Here he would light his cigar and see what interesting folks passed him by. He was disappointed that another Hallows Eve was going to drift away without event, but at least he got to stretch his limbs and burn some fine tobacco. For several minutes he watched the crowds of ghosts, werewolves, vampires, mummies, skeletons, witches, and scarecrows walk up and down the street, enjoying the night. Then, during a lull, he slid the long, fat cigar out from his breast pocket and clamped it between his teeth. Next, he pulled out a small box of matches. One thing about the old Strike Anywheres was that they were hardy and didn't go bad easily. The cool, dry crypt and cigar box only aided in their long lives. He pulled one out, and in a jerk snapped his thumb across the head, which hissed and flared to life in a dancing amber flame. His skeletal face, which had been completely concealed now, shone in its bleached brilliance as the light danced in the deep hollows of his eye sockets and across his brilliant, pearly teeth. But before he could touch the match to the end of his cigar, the sharp voice of a young woman called out to his right. "David!" He turned. A young blonde woman dressed as a witch, complete with hat, black cloak, and rustic broom, walked up to him looking very cross. Even with her black-rimmed glasses with thick lenses, he could see her brow knitted in frustration. "David, Just because it's Halloween doesn't mean you get to just start smoking again to go with your costume. We went over this last year. You'll get hooked all over again, and you know how hard it's been for you to stay quit. Also, where have you been? We're late. I was waiting for you at Steve's party for a bit, but when you didn't show up, I decided to head over to Rob and Lydia's without you." The Lich shook out the match and stared at the woman for a moment, then said, "My name's Hiram." The woman cocked her head, then rolled her eyes and shook it, saying, "Oh, David, you get into your characters, don't you?" She was slurring her speech slightly, like she'd been drinking but wasn't quite drunk. She brushed dust off his sleeves, shoulders, and collar, and continued, "My, you really went all out this year. You said you were going to be a corpse, but this is... Wow, you look so real." "Thank you," replied Hiram, still not quite sure how to respond to this sudden development. It was then that an idea flashed into his mind. Why not take this opportunity and see what happens? Behind this woman, Hiram noticed a large potted mum at the end of a house's walkway, within reach of the sidewalk. He returned the cigar to his pocket, walked over to the flowers, plucked a handful of them from the plant, and held them out to the blonde witch. "I'm so sorry I was late, Mon Belle. Can you please forgive me?" "Mon Belle?" she asked. "My beauty," replied Hiram. The woman placed her hand on her breast and blushed, looking touched at the gesture. She took the flowers and said, "Oh, David, or Hiram, how romantic of you." "Thank you, sweetheart. Of course I forgive you. Now let's go. We're missing all the fun." Grabbing Hiram by the arm, the witch led him down the street. Hiram let himself be led. His excitement for the night had returned. They had only gone a few blocks before the young woman slowed her pace and began to walk up to a single-story house whose outside light fixtures' bulbs had been replaced to create a purple glow. The violet hue of these lights made for a darkly lit facade of the building. Through the windows, strobes and dancing lights of various colors could be seen. The rumble of loud music from within reached the pair on the sidewalk. Ghosts, witches, a person dressed as a bag of M&M's candy, and all other manner of costumed people were congregating at this house. There were conversations being had on the lawn. The garage door was open. The beams of a strobe light lit up the fog that was spewing out of its gaping mouth. Each blast cast silhouettes of the people mingling inside intermittently into the dense mist. As they neared the house, a werewolf staggered out, leaned over the railing of the stoop, and vomited into the bushes. When the door had opened, the music came much more clearly to the ears of those on the front lawn. It was currently eerie ambiance music with ghoulish laughter, groans, and animal cries intermittently mingling with the dissonant tones. Hiram's date caught the front door and led him inside. Here there were even more costumed people dancing. In the dining room at the back of the house, Hiram could see people dishing up plates with food and desserts from a table that was covered with various items he could not yet make out. There were small groups of people talking to each other over the music, which wasn't deafening, but was loud enough to cause the partygoers to raise their voices to be heard. The front rooms of the house were lit with a bluish-purple light that made the white of his bones pop in a bright neon glow. When the woman looked back and smiled at him, her teeth were the same brilliant color, and her earrings, which had been a dull light green, now glowed with a brilliance that made them look luminescent themselves. He noticed a piano on the side of the living room. It was covered in twinkling black, orange, and purple candles. His hands ached momentarily to dance over its keys. It had been a very long time. "We have to find Rob and Lydia to let them know we made it," shouted the woman toward Hiram, snapping his attention back to her. He nodded in return. They wound their way through the living room and back toward the kitchen near the food table. The light here was a normal white color, probably so people could see the food they were eating. A thin man slightly taller than Hiram, with greasy black hair and a thick black mustache, walked down the hall from their left and entered the kitchen at the same time as the pair did. "Robert," said the woman. "Reggie, David, yes! I've been waiting for you guys to get here," shouted the man, hugging the woman that Hiram now knew was named Reggie. The man was dressed in a white sleeveless undershirt, sunglasses, and tight, light-colored pants. He wore an armband around his right bicep. "Holy shit, Dave, you really outdid yourself this year," said Rob, gripping Hiram's sides and pulling him into a tight hug. "You just had to one-up my Freddie Mercury costume, didn't you?" "Is that who you are?" replied Hiram, and the trio laughed together. Rob showed the two over to the kitchen counter where an array of items were displayed. He showed them each individual dish and talked about how spooky they all were in a jokingly sarcastic tone, and told them about how Lydia and her sisters had worked on the food all of yesterday and today. There were chocolate chip cookie sandwiches filled with red icing and marshmallows to look like mouths filled with teeth. There was a cheesecake that appeared to be covered in blood and eyeballs. Apples on a stick covered in white and black frosting to look like skulls. Skewered fruit made to look like bugs and spiders. And at the end, a giant crystal bowl filled with dark red punch. As they watched, a man dressed as a lumberjack used an oversized ladle to pour the thin red liquid into a cup for himself, and one into the glass of the mummy he was standing next to. Hiram didn't think any of it was all that spooky. Rob led them through the house and out to the garage, looking for his wife. They stopped here and there and chatted with various old friends of Reggie's and David's, were introduced to new friends, and admired various decorative fixtures that their host was very proud of. They found Lydia in the backyard near a small bonfire. She was short, thin, and also blonde. She looked rather similar to Reggie. The two women hugged, and then she hugged Hiram, saying hello to David as she did so. Reggie corrected her, telling the two finally that tonight David was to be called Hiram. They all shared another laugh, and Rob again commented on his friend's incredible costume. "You haven't even seen the half of it yet," replied Hiram to the latest compliment. He raised his right arm and, using his left, gripped just above his wrist inside his suit sleeve. With a short, sharp grinding sound, a skeletal forearm popped free of the sleeve. Hiram held it out to his new friend, who shook it with a shocked look on his face and started laughing. Rob began pulling Hiram around the party, showing off his arm trick, as well as other appendage removal gags to groups of partiers. Most people seemed to enjoy it. A couple even grabbing at his sleeve to see where his real arm was. By this time, a small crowd had begun following them around. Hiram was drawing in his own little audience. So after a few shows of the same scheme, he wanted to give them something different. In the living room, a few people were playing card games at a small table. Hiram asked the woman shuffling if he could do a card trick for them. She handed him the deck, and he leaned over, glancing at all the participants as he began his spiel. "Okay, everyone. I'm going to deal 3 rows of 7 cards." He started but was cut off. "Turn the music off!" shouted Rob. In a moment, Monster Mash was suddenly cut short, and the room was silent except for the murmuring of the crowd. "Sorry, Dave, go ahead." "Thank you, sir," continued Hiram with a slight bow. "Now, as I said, 3 rows of 7 cards. That's 21 cards. This young lady here is going to look over the rows and choose one of them. I'll turn my back and she can point it to you so you all know which one it is." When he had finished dealing the rows, he made a flourish, bade the woman to choose a card, and he turned his back, stepping out of the circle of onlookers. When she had clearly shown everyone that the card she had chosen was the Queen of Hearts in the center row, they called him back to the table. "Okay, so now you're going to do all the magic and choose your own card again. Tell me which row the card is in." The woman told him it was in the center row, and he quickly gathered up the cards. He dealt out the 3 rows, but in a different order a second time, had the woman choose the row again, and then did it a third time before gathering them up and continuing his speech. "Now, messieurs and mesdames, I will make the beautiful lady 4 flowers, as she deserves, and it is from these that she will choose her own card." He laid the cards out face down in 4 groups that mocked 5-petal and 1 6-petal flower shapes. From here he asked her to choose 2 of the flowers. She chose 2 that he gathered quickly up and set aside. From the remaining 2 flowers he asked her to choose 1 more. She hesitated, pointed at one, but before he made a move she changed her mind and pointed at the other. "A good choice, mon bel," he said, and with another wave and twirl of his wrist he swept up the flower she had chosen and discarded it with the others. Then he spread the petals of the last flower out into a line of 5 cards, again asking her to choose 3, sweeping those aside, then asking her to choose one final one. When she made up her mind and pointed, he removed the other card she had not picked and said, "Now flip over the card." When she did, it was the Queen of Hearts. There were gasps, "Wow, how did he do that?" And then everyone broke out in a cheer. "What else can you do?" asked someone else in the group. "Have you heard of the water into wine?" asked the Lich. Several people responded in the affirmative. "Well, what if I turned the punch into blood?" He raised his hand and snapped his bony fingers, then held his sides as he laughed a deep laugh. The entire party laughed along with him. The dead man was having a wonderful time. All the sights, sounds, and interesting people, the attention, the applause, the life that this party had was splendid. "Do you want to hear some really spooky music?" asked Hiram. He was greeted with a unanimous yes from everyone in response. He walked over to the piano he had noticed earlier. The crowd parted for him like the waters of the Red Sea for Moses. He slid back the bench, sat down, stretched his arms out, and began to play. Everyone stood and listened in an awed silence as the corpse, who they thought was their friend David, played a piano arrangement of the Queen of the Night aria from Mozart's Magic Flute opera. He finished and stood back from the piano as everyone cheered his performance. Rob and Reggie exchanged a surprised glance. They both knew David could play the piano, but he usually just played some decent Elton John or Bruce Hornsby. Nothing like this. "Why is that scary?" asked someone to his right. "I'm glad you asked. The song is called Der holle Rache kocht in meinem Herzen, which means Hell's vengeance boils in my heart. In that song, the Queen of the Night gives a dagger to her daughter and tells her to kill her rival. It is a beautiful and terrible thing. They say Mozart told his wife he heard the notes of that song as he lay on his deathbed years later, just before he died." Until well past midnight, the party continued just the same. Hiram going from one thing to the next, captivating his audience, telling jokes, playing music, doing magic. They loved it. Just as he had been decades ago, he was again the life of the party. As the night wound on, the partygoers began to thin. They said their goodbyes, and after hugging Rob and Lydia again, Hiram pulled a gold coin out from behind Lydia's ear and placed it in her palm, thanking her for her hospitality. They all laughed, and Hiram and Reggie walked out, back into the night. The two had been the last to leave the party. Lydia walked into the kitchen. She wanted to at least put a few things away before heading to bed. She pulled the coin out of her pocket and looked at it for the first time since their friend had given it to her. It was heavy, gold and yellow, had a woman's profile on one side and an eagle with a shield on the other. Below the woman's head was the year, 1882, and wrapped around the eagle were the words, United States of America, $20, while above its head was the phrase, In God We Trust. Could this be real? Is this gold? She thought. She would have to give it back to David if it was. She couldn't accept this. It was surely worth more than $20, if that was the case. She put the coin back in her pocket and began to move a few food items to the fridge and wrap up others. The last thing she wanted to take care of was the punch. She was going to pour it down the sink, rinse the bowl, and head to bed. She tried to pull the ladle out of the bowl, and it took a little extra effort to do so when she did. There was a sucking sound, and she had to pull upward. She grimaced with disgust as she did. There was a round hole left where the ladle had been in the middle of what she thought had been liquid. When she tipped the utensil up, a scoop-shaped blob of congealed burgundy mass plopped back down into the bowl, splashing her face with drops of damp, warm liquid. She wiped at it with her hand, which came away from her face, stained a deep blood red. Hiram and Reggie walked down the sidewalk of Silver Lake Road, Reggie's hand in the crook of Hiram's arm. She talked about how much he had surprised her tonight. She was proud of him for coming out of his shell a little more than usual and stealing the show. She always knew he had it in him to be confident and fun. She leaned her head on his shoulder and told him what a good time she had had and how much she appreciated him. Then as they approached the same lighted street corner at which they had so recently met, she stopped and pulled on his elbow so he was facing her. She stepped toward him, wrapped her arms around him, moved her face toward his, and at the same time, removed his hat. The streetlight shone down on his uncovered skull. She stopped and stared at him mid-approach. She hadn't noticed in the darkened rooms the shadows of his hat brim and the excitement of the night, but there was nowhere for him to be behind a mask. There was no room here for the concealment of a costume. She gazed into the eye sockets of a completely real skull, bleached with age, marked with lines and cracks and the passage of time. David had great costumes, but this was no costume. She pushed the corpse away from her. The skull's expression did not change. The dark holes of its eyes just beamed toward her. The color drained from her face as her mouth dropped open. She began to make gurgling, sobbing sounds as she backed away, dropping her broom. Hiram reached out. She backed away faster, turned and ran screaming down the street the way she had initially come when they met. Hiram stood beneath the street lamp, clutching his hat and watching her run. He wished that part hadn't happened, but it was inevitable, he supposed. When she turned to the corner out of sight, he placed the hat back on his head, took out his cigar and clamped it back in his teeth. He struck a match on his thumb and lit the end of the cigar. He couldn't inhale it, but he could damned well burn it down to a nub. He turned and walked slowly back toward the churchyard from whence he had come, tipping his hat to a little red-headed girl that walked past him. She was wearing a dress in a style he remembered from his own time. Into the cool, crisp night, Hiram walked, happy with his luck and the course of events. He couldn't remember the last time he had felt so alive. The Hidden Oaks podcast is a collaboration between Patrick W. Marsh, Robert Dawn, and Owen Swerkstrom. The story Amy's Journal, written by Owen Swerkstrom. The Masquerade, by Patrick W. Marsh. And The Death of the Party, by Robert Dawn. The voice of Hidden Oaks, performed by Robert Dawn. Original music composed and performed by David Schwartz. Find more of his works at dtschwartz.com. Produced by Robert Dawn, Owen Swerkstrom, and Patrick W. Marsh. Make sure to check out the website to see the fantastic mugs that James from BreachersInc.com made for us for the contest. You can find out more online by visiting us at hiddenoakspodcast.com or by finding us on Twitter at Hidden Oaks Pod, as well as Facebook and Instagram at Hidden Oaks Podcast. Hidden Oaks is an Ironfield independent production. Thank you for listening. And until next time.